Welcome to your video on biogeochemical cycles. This is Chapter 7, Part 2, and this covers carbon, phosphorus, water, and nitrogen. Please notice that the sulfur cycle is not in your book, so will not be on the quiz that is a part of the assignments that you got. It will be featured both in class and on a separate supplemental video, so you can expect to see the sulfur cycle on an exam. Let's get started. All right. So, your first question says, would you describe biogeochemical cycles as one large turning wheel or many turning wheels that are interconnected? Does each wheel turn at the same speed? Well, you guys already went through the water cycle, and as some of you discovered, some of the wheels move very, very slowly. So there are parts to these cycles that move very slow. The nutrients get trapped in certain areas, and then in other places they move very quick. Now, you need to know the vocabulary terms associated with this. So, nutrients move from one reservoir to another, and a reservoir is a place where they stay for a long time, remaining in each reservoir for varying amounts of time. That's called a residence time. The movement of nutrients among reservoirs is termed flux, and the rate of flux between any given reservoir can change over time. So, the time it takes to move from one reservoir to another is residence time, and then that actual movement is called flux. A source is a reservoir that releases more nutrients than it accepts, and a sink accepts more nutrients than it releases. So that describes the wheels in terms of reservoirs, residence time, flux, sources, and sinks. All of this is a part of a law of conservation of matter, which says that you are not God. Matter can neither be created nor destroyed, so it has to go somewhere. The issue that we're going to see in environmental science is the wheel is set up in such a way that it turns just well enough so that everybody gets what they need. People, of course, have decided to alter the course of parts of the wheel, creating some of the environmental problems that we see today. You need to know the following things about all the cycles: where a nutrient is at any given time, how a nutrient moves from one reservoir to another, formulas of compounds as indicated, sinks and sources for each cycle, human influences on the cycle, and any special features of the cycle. These do pop up on the national exam every year. All right, we're going to start with the carbon cycle. What is the main atmospheric component of the carbon cycle? That would be carbon dioxide, which is CO2, and that 2 is a subscript. You need to know its name and its chemical formula. You will see CO2 the way it's supposed to look a little bit later on in this video. All right, what process transforms atmospheric carbon into a form living organisms can use? That would be photosynthesis. What is the single largest reservoir in the carbon cycle? In other words, where does this stuff stay forever? Number 1 is carbonate rock. It's usually in the form of calcium carbonate. That would be C, lowercase a, big C, big O, 3. An example of this is limestone. The second largest is the world ocean. Also, that sedimentary rock is usually found in ocean basins and freshwater wetlands, and it's usually made of the shells and skeletons of dead organisms. So clam shells, mussel shells, shells you find out on Sanibel Island, those are all made out of calcium carbonate, limestone. Second largest reservoir is, again, the world ocean. It absorbs carbon-containing compounds from the atmosphere, from terrestrial runoff, from undersea volcanoes, and from the waste products and detritus of marine organisms. That's just trash. Forms include carbon dioxide, which is CO2, carbonate ions, which is CO3, 2-, and these are right here on the slide, and then HCO3-, which is called a bicarbonate ion. Rates of absorption depend on a variety of things, which I'm going to get to momentarily. Now, some other examples of sinks would be fossil fuels, which we are slowly but surely depleting, and then also large-scale forests can be considered a carbon sink, especially things like redwood forests where the trees live for hundreds of years. Sources include things like plants and animals, because in the scheme of things, they don't exist for very long, and when they die, you go ahead and release that carbon back into the cycle. All right, so when it comes to the ocean, rates of absorption of carbon dioxide into the water is based on a couple of things. One of them is it's based on the temperature of the water, and this is something you need to know. Warm water holds less gas than cold water, and you already know this. If you take a soda, a cold soda that's all super fizzy, and you were to warm it up, all the carbonation would be released. So warmer water holds less gas than cold water. So the colder the water is, the more effectively it acts as a carbon sink, a place that holds carbon away from the rest of the cycle. It also depends on the number of photosynthetic marine organisms that are present, because they convert carbon dioxide into carbohydrates and then those carbonate ions. And carbonate is CO3 2-, which you can go ahead and see right here on this slide. You can also see the formula for the bicarbonate ion. You just need to straight up memorize those. That is non-negotiable. All right, again, identify another long-term carbon reservoir. As you saw in the previous slide, that's fossil fuels and trees. What are two main ways that humans are altering the carbon cycle? Describe the process and where the carbon is shifting from and to. One is the burning of fossil fuels. They are hydrocarbons, and when you burn anything, it's called combustion, and combustion releases carbon dioxide and water vapor in the same way that cellular respiration does. So, or carbon monoxide, which is just CO. And so you burn fossil fuels, you release that carbon back into the atmosphere. The same is true of burning trees. In a lot of places where they cut trees down for farmland, instead of harvesting the trees and, say, sending them to a timber factory or a paper plant, they just go ahead and burn it. And when you burn wood, again, that is combustion, and you release carbon dioxide and water vapor. This is a couple of other pictures of carbon cycle that may make a little bit more sense to you. Feel free to pause anytime you like. I should be able to post these slides for you to get at for studying purposes within the next week on some sort of website that I am just going to make. All right, next cycle is the phosphorus cycle. Why is phosphorus important to living organisms? It's in things like DNA, RNA, ATP, and ADP, which you should know already from biology. Identify the component largely absent from the phosphorus cycle. This question pops up all the time on the national exam. The phosphorus cycle is the only nutrient cycle that does not have an atmospheric component. You either find it in water or in a rock or in organisms. You do not find it floating around in the air. All right, identify the main sink for the phosphorus cycle. How is this linked to plant growth? The main sink is rock, phosphate rock, which you learned from the cartoon guide, contained there as the phosphate ion, which is PO4 3-. Released only by weathering, it's released very slowly, so it's often a limiting factor for terrestrial plant growth. So, to explain what a limiting factor is, if you take a look at the barrel on the left, you can see that the pieces of wood that make it up, they're called staves, are of varying lengths. You can only hold as much water as the smallest stave will allow you to. So that is the limiting factor for how much water that thing can hold. There on the right, you can see that the different pieces of wood are named different things. In this particular case, water is a limiting factor, but more often it's going to be phosphorus, because again, it's locked in rock and this whole entire cycle grinds very, very slowly. So if the phosphorus runs out, the plants stop growing and it becomes a limiting factor. So you can only have as many plants grow in an area as you have phosphorus, as an example. This explains why an artificial influx, like fertilizer runoff, can cause an explosion of plant growth. They go, oh my God, and they start growing. Identify two ways in which humans impact the phosphorus cycle. One is through mining. You mine rock for the phosphate ion, which is used in artificial fertilizer, which can then lead to eutrophication. But you can also see that just the mining waste also can run off into, into the water. Also, it's also used, or it used to be used in detergents, which can also end up in water because it's not targeted in wastewater treatment. However, and this is where your book is a little out of date, detergents are not a problem anymore, as it's largely been removed since about 2010. This was a huge issue, especially here in Southwest Florida. So detergents don't work as well as they used to because it was the phosphate ions that did the scrubbing. So if you look basically at any dishwashing detergent that you see, they're all phosphate free. But you can see that phosphates are still included in sewage, so runoff from that can be a problem. Here's another example of the phosphorus cycle, so you feel free to pause again on any of these slides. This is your video, and take a look. All right, moving on. You know what? To pause real quick, I was accused of showing favoritism in calling one of my students out in the last video, so let's see who can come to mind to name check here. I will say Miss Mayo. I wonder if you're actually watching this video at all. You're the low-key chill girl in the back of my class, and I don't know when you watch the videos or if you just kind of read the book or study with somebody else. So if you're watching the video, hey, welcome. It's good to have you. All right, nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen is really interesting because, believe it or not, 78% of the atmosphere is atmospheric nitrogen, which is N2. So you would think, oh, well, plant growth should go nuts because nitrogen is literally everywhere around. The problem is atmospheric nitrogen is not in a form that plants can use. Again, essential for plant growth along with phosphorus, so it has to somehow be transformed into a form that can be consumed by plants. Why is this important? You find nitrogen in proteins, in DNA, and RNA, and plants are the way that we get the nitrogen that we need to survive. The form of nitrogen that plants can use are NH4+, which is called the ammonium ion, and NO3-, which is called the nitrate ion. How does this happen? A couple of different ways. And I am totally serious about what I said right here. This cycle pops up a lot. You need to memorize all of it. All right. Here are the formulas that you need to know. I would pause here, write this stuff down, make note cards, whatever it is you do to force knowledge in your brain. N2 is atmospheric nitrogen. It's a gas. NH3 is ammonia. Yes, it's just like the ammonia you buy at the store. It's the main component in urea. That's PP. And it readily converts to NH4+, which is the ammonium ion. Note the charge. This can be used by plants, and because it is an ion, you find it in water. NO2- is the nitrite ion. That is an intermediate form. That means that as you're converting to nitrate, it goes NH4+, NO2-, and then NO3-, which is the nitrate ion. That is the form of nitrogen most readily used by plants according to AP Central, which is the folks who make your test. This is not in your book. Your book has NH4+ and NO3- as being equivalent. Plants really dig the nitrate ion more. Okay, again, remember, any of those ions, you really only find them in water. Then you have NO, which is nitrogen monoxide, and NO2, which is nitrogen dioxide. Those are gases, and they are intermediate forms of nitrogen. HNO3 is nitric acid, and it readily converts to the nitrate ion, which is NO3-. Okay, how do we get there? Biological fixation is the most common route. It's facilitated by bacteria that live in the root nodules of plants like alfalfa, clover, and legumes, which is in the bean family. And I'm going to show you pictures of that stuff in just a second. Plants that don't have these bacteria depend upon those listed above for nitrogen. You access the nitrogen by either growing near one of these plants or by using nitrogen from decaying organisms. You must know that chemical formula. If you know anything about chemistry, it's not balanced because the H kind of magically appears there. Don't worry about it. As far as you're concerned, magical hydrogen fairies come and are a part of the process. You need to know that N2 atmospheric nitrogen, through the magical action of bacteria, becomes NH3, which is ammonia, and NH4+, which is the ammonium ion. Although NH4+ can be used by plants, it's not the preferred form. So, that is biotic nitrogen fixation, or biological fixation. Nitrification. Again, facilitated by bacteria. You're going to hear this a lot. You don't have to know the bacteria of any of these, by the way. Just know that there's different bacteria. Whenever you see an arrow, for the most part, that means, hey, bacteria is a part of this. So, you'll notice that the stuff from the previous step is first converted to nitrite, then nitrate. Remember, plants can uptake or assimilate either NH4 plus or NO3 minus at any point during the cycle. Consumers then get their nitrogen either directly or indirectly from plants. If you can't tell, plants are the entry point for lots of stuff into our ecosystem. Okay, so we have biotic nitrogen fixation, nitrification, denitrification. Again, shocking, facilitated by bacteria. It is an example of a negative feedback loop. You have a lot of NO3 minus, lots of bacteria breed and do what they need to do. When the NO3 minus disappears, the bacteria die off, and there you go. Negative feedback loop. You go from NO3 minus back to atmospheric nitrogen. Forgive the spacing in this word here. It helps to draw a complete cycle that reflected all of the info already presented. The cycles in this presentation are incomplete or not completely correct. That would be the nitrogen cycles that are in here. We'll do an activity in class to help you put all this together, but really start now. So we've got biotic fixation, nitrification, denitrification. What living organism is responsible for all of these steps? Bacteria. This is considered a bottleneck or a limiting step that slows the flow of nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So because the bacteria have to work to do their thing, you don't have a ton of nitrogen coming out of the atmosphere. Now, how does abiotic fixation take place? It's a lightning strike, and it follows these 4 steps. Atmospheric nitrogen becomes NO and NO2, which then becomes HNO3, which becomes NO3 minus. This accounts for only 10% of all conversion of nitrogen into a form usable by organisms. Not a lot, but still significant enough for us to pay attention to. All right, definitely know the 10% part. So, what type of plants are associated with biotic nitrogen fixation? Soybeans, legumes, I love saying that word, like green beans as an example, alfalfa, and clover. Those last two are not listed in your book. So, you need to understand this part. Bacteria are not a part of the plant. They are in a mutualistic relationship with the plant. Think of the nodules as bacteria condos. So you can see in the pictures that where the nitrogen creating bacteria live. All right, legume here on the left. This is clover on the right. And you can feel free to pause here if you really want to know how this whole thing works. This would not appear on the national exam, fairly certain. Some of the finer details are best guess, but this will not kill your ability to pass the exam if you don't know this whole thing, but just so you can see all the different steps. All right, other ways nitrogen enters the soil. This will not be on the quiz that you are going to take after watching this or listening to it, but you can't expect to see this on a unit test. You've got animal elimination. Urea and feces, which is pee-pee and poo-poo, contain ammonia and ammonium. There's also something called ammonification, and that's what happens when organisms decay. They convert nitrogen in the organism's body to ammonia and ammonium again. However, this you do need to know, the Haber-Bosch process. It is the creation of an artificial fertilizer from hydrogen and nitrogen gases. It was originally developed for the ammonia that was used in explosives. Then somebody realized, actually the Bosch there, Haber's the one who came up with the idea, Bosch is the one who applied it to fertilizer, and it's to make industrial farming easier. Before this, you had to depend on manure and grass clippings or greenery clippings for nitrogen enrichment of the soil. This is a lot easier. How has it impacted the nitrogen cycle? It has doubled the amount of nitrogen removed from the atmosphere and introduced into soil and water in a form plants can readily use. And as we've seen with eutrophication, it can lead to unintended consequences like fish kills. Okay, here's a picture of the nitrogen cycle. Again, as I mentioned before, kind of incomplete, but it gives you an idea of what it looks like. Here's another picture of the nitrogen cycle, again, to let you know what's going on. Oh, look, nitrogen cycle. All right, human impacts on the nitrogen cycle. The first one that's listed here is excess nitrogen leads to eutrophication. The excess can come from industrial livestock and pets, also from the Haber-Bosch process. Waste can also anaerobically, and anaerobic means without oxygen, be decomposed by bacteria into N2O, which is nitrous oxide. The destruction of wetlands and the growth of more legumes equals more nitrogen-rich compounds that are then introduced into aquatic and terrestrial systems, and then the combustion of fossil fuels. In addition to hydrocarbons, there are some nitrogen-bearing compounds in fossil fuels, and this releases nitrogen compounds that eventually become acid rain. So that HNO3 builds up beyond that 10% level, and it actually does become caustic to our buildings. And then there is a cascading process you're going to learn about later that indirectly ends up killing fish and also causing plants to die. All right, I used to do notes more structured. This secret question I think I'll talk about in class. I don't know what I'm going to do with these in terms of I may offer extra credit for them later on. I really haven't decided. Remind me if I forget. Hey Morris, what are you going to do about the secret question? All right, here's a secret question that I'm not going to answer for you. Why would farmers plant alfalfa and clover in a field, let them grow, never harvest them, and then plow the whole plant into the soil when it was done growing? There are really two parts to this answer, two reasons for doing this. So, think about it. All right, last cycle, water cycle. This memorize everything. No, seriously, I really hope you've seen this cycle before. Oh, look, it's my fabulous drawing. And yes, that is still a cow here on the left-hand side. You'll notice I forgot the elimination part, but since we all know everything poops, I really didn't think that was going to be a problem. All right, use appropriate vocabulary terms to describe how water moves through the biosphere. The ocean is the main reservoir for water. It holds 97% of all water on Earth, which is salty. Fresh water is only 3% of all water, with 2/3 of this locked in ice, like glaciers, snowfields, and ice caps. The rest of the fresh water is in groundwater, surface fresh water, rain from atmospheric vapor. Water moves from the surface of the Earth to the atmosphere through evaporation. Warmth and wind speed this process. Water is released by plants through leaves, which is called transpiration. Transpiration and evaporation are the only steps that result in purified water. Water, and then, well, I actually take that back. Your book does not include infiltration. The act of infiltrating through the soil can also cleanse water. Water returns to Earth through precipitation, and then uptake is when it's ingested by plants and animals. Elimination is waste product of animals. And then runoff is flow from one place to another on the surface. Some water infiltrates the soil to reach aquifers, which are basically holding tanks for water. And then it can be discharged to surface from there through natural or man-made wells. All right, so what exactly is an aquifer? Oh, look, here's the water cycle again. Feel free to pause if you need to. Water cycle again. All right, here is an aquifer. Let me tell you what an aquifer is not. An aquifer is not an underground lake. It is not this giant bubble. Like, it's not a Capri Sun pouch. What it is soil and or rocks that are porous, that has lots of holes. It's kind of like a sponge. Like, think about a sponge when you've used it for a while and it's kind of dried out. And so it's dry, but it still has those holes that can hold water. So, 3 parts. Zone of saturation, which is it's saturated, and that means completely full of water. The zone of aeration, which is places where it can still hold water. And then the water table is that line that divides the two. Where the water table is largely depends on where you are. There are some places where you have to dig hundreds and hundreds of feet, sometimes upwards of a mile, to get down to the water table. This is especially true of areas where you have taken water out of the aquifer faster than it can get back in there. Like, I don't know, California right now. There are also places where the water table is virtually at the surface of the soil. Places like that include New Orleans. If you've ever been in New Orleans, you've noticed that the graveyards feature crypts, mausoleums, and places where you put your dead, where you put coffins. You don't bury people in a lot of places in New Orleans, because if you did, the coffins would come bobbing to the surface within a matter of days, because the water table in a lot of places in New Orleans is right at the surface of the soil. So they had to put people above ground because they couldn't dig into the soil. All right, kiddos, we are almost done. Water can be trapped in aquifers for thousands of years, and it can take as long to recharge when overused by humans. All right, here are some aquifers. We're going to talk about this a little bit later in the school year. Just be aware that aquifers can either recharge over large areas, or sometimes they're like bottles and they have this just tiny little neck, and we'll discuss the ramifications of that. And please notice that you get water through wells, which is basically like, not that they're Capri Sun pouches, but it's like punching a straw in there and then you suck it out. All right, human impacts. Dams. That restricts river flow, and it creates a reservoir of water, a lake behind the dam. So you've really changed where the water is. Increased evaporation can occur in created reservoirs, and then also when you overwater crops. Alteration of the land, like for construction, can lead to increased runoff and soil erosion. Soil erosion leads to sterile soil that will not support plant growth. Then, because remember, plants slow or stop runoff and act as short-term reservoirs for water. So that would be an amplification cycle, a feedback loop, which is a positive feedback loop. There's also pollution in all parts of the cycle, basically making the water unfit for human use or even agricultural use. And then overuse of aquifers and other freshwater sources. We're kind of running out of water that is not salty. All right, I am going to create a supplemental video on the sulfur cycle. We're also going to talk about it in class. So this has gone on long enough. I'm going to end right here, and hopefully I'm a bit perkier. And I will see you soon for your quiz. Bye-bye.